Hey, friends, welcome to The Wonder of Tolkien. My name is Christopher, and this is the second interview that we get to do together. And I have a fun friend on here, James, with me. This is the first time that James and I are interacting face to face, but we've been pen pals on Twitter for a couple of years. I'm still going to call it Twitter, James. Is that okay?
That's fine by me.
Really honored to have you on the channel. I've admired your work from afar. I've used some of your tools on your website, which we're going to talk about. And so, yeah, just so good to have you, friend. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
We're going to nerd out, folks, on a whole bunch of things. And so if you don't know James, he definitely wears many hats. He's an entrepreneur, a software developer, a linguistics major. I heard that you got your MA in corpus linguistics last year.
I did.
Okay.
Working on Tolkien.
Come on.
Tolkien focus, so yeah.
We're going to talk a lot more about that. And a full-blown Tolkien nerd, which is the reason why you're on this channel, because we want to have some wonderful conversation, and we're going to talk about your work with Digital Tolkien and all of that stuff that's coming up as well. So I want to start with a fun fact. We were tweeting a few years ago, back and forth, and you had mentioned, this blew my mind, because, again, I'm 4 years into the fandom plus, so I'm a newbie. You said you had 54 Silmarillions that you have in your collection. Is that still true? I'm sure it's still true, but I'm sure there's probably a few more you've added since then.
I think it's up to 72 now.
Wait, what? See, I'm so glad I started with this fact, because if no one knows who you are, that should give you a good picture of just the kind of person you are, the kind of nerd Tolkien. Okay, before we jump into everything, why 72?
Well, it's still increasing as well. So the story behind that is that and we're going to get into a lot more detail, I'm sure, about what I do at the Digital Tolkien project. But what I was trying to do initially was compare the first edition of the Silmarillion to the latest edition of the Silmarillion. And so I had copies of both, and I scanned them and did optical character recognition to get the text in, and then did a comparison. And my primary reason, there were two reasons for doing the comparison. One was to find any errors in my scanning, but also to see what the actual differences were. And once I went through and corrected the mistakes that had happened in the scanning process, I found there were 40 places where there was a difference between the first version and the last version. And that opened up the question, well, when were those changes made? Were they made a year later, 10 years later, 20 years later? And so I started trying to get as many copies of the Silmarillion I could and then look at those 40 places to say, when did it change? And it led to this wonderful reconstruction of sort of the publishing history of the Silmarillion. There were mistakes that were corrected in sort of one line of the texts in the 80s, but were still in other lines of the text in the 2010s.
Whoa.
And so it's just been fun. Anytime I pick up a copy of the Silmarillion, I'm like, I go check, did they correct this? Did they correct that? And it led to something I was not expecting, this building this whole history of the different versions of the Silmarillion. And they're tiny things, unlike something like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, that got changed quite substantially from one edition to another. There aren't that many changes in the Silmarillion. In some cases, they're just a change in punctuation, a comma moved or something like that. But it gives you a hint as to the publication history. Because certainly before the advent of computers, it's sort of very computer-based publishing, any time you wanted to do a new edition of the text, it would be rekeyed. Somebody would typeset it again, and so there was always the chance that new mistakes would be introduced, and that tells you a lot about the history of the published text. So that's why I have 72s.
Okay, my wife was like, do you think it's like maybe 55, 56? And I'm like, I'm sure it's gone up a little bit. I didn't think it would come up 20. So you're the reason why if I go, hey, babe, can I have another Hobbit? I'm like, James has 54, now 72 Silmarillions. I need a couple more.
There you go. And I think I've got about 10 copies of each of the volumes of History of Middle-earth as well. So
you need to support his work, people, so you can afford more books like this.
Right.
So
that's right.
Okay, I want to jump into your story of Tolkien.
Sure.
Folks probably have heard how you got started, but I want to key in on a certain aspect of it. I know at age 11, you had read The Hobbit. At age 12, I think your aunt brought you The Return of the King. And because
Yes.
that was the third book in the trilogy, you jumped to the appendices first.
Exactly. In fact, do I have I have it sitting nearby? Yeah. So I recognized that it was I mean, it says on the top, being the third part of Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, I can't read this. I haven't read parts 1 and part 2, but I couldn't help but look at the pages, and I noticed these appendices, and in particular in Appendix E, you get the Tengwar, and I just fell in love with this writing system. And as I read the description of how systematic it was, because one of the things people may not be aware about the Tengwar is it's unusual for a writing system in that the correspondences between the way that you make the sounds and the way that the letters are drawn are very close. And so, you've got these bows, and you've got a stem that goes up or down, and how many bows you have and what direction the bows are in and whether the stem goes up and down actually corresponds to the mouth position, where your tongue is, whether
That's
you
beautiful.
voice it with your vocal cords and so on. So it's extremely systematic. I didn't realize at the time that was planting the seeds in me to end up becoming a linguist, because when I went on later to study at university and I started doing linguistics, I'm like, I know all this terminology. Where have I read these terms before? And I realized it was in Appendix E of Lord of the Rings. So,
Oh my gosh. So you weren't into linguistics or language before you had no interest really before you read the appendices?
so well, I mean, I was only 12 years old at the time.
You weren't writing code for something?
I was, well, there are a few things that got me interested in linguistics. One of them was Appendix E. The other thing that was happening around the same time was these text adventure games. These games you would play on the computer where you would interact with this world by typing in simple sentences. You would say, pick up the lamp, or go through go north, or something like that. And in fact, there was a Hobbit text adventure game. It had a little bit of graphics too, but from a company called Melbourne House that I was playing at the time as well. So it was a fun combination of Tolkien related stuff and these text adventure games. But I wanted to build those kind of games. They were sort of like, I want to know how these work. And as I, being 12, 13 years old, researched, this is before I had access to the internet. There's no World Wide Web or anything. So it wasn't, you had to look at computer magazines or something to try to find out more about how these things were built. But it turned out that they had linguistics underlying them, right? All these articles that talked about how they worked would talk about how you had these dictionaries of words, these lexicons, and how what you typed in, the sentences you typed in, got parsed by the computer, and so again, I don't think I consciously realized at the time, but later on, when I started looking into linguistics at university, I'm like, I've seen all this stuff before, and it's because of Tolkien and because of these computer games.
I love it. When you're reading the story, kind of separated from linguistics in general, what hooked you in the story? Like, what was it about the story that moved you to say, this is worth reading, this is worth going deeper in, and not just another book on the shelf?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the Hobbit was the starting point, as you've mentioned, and it was funny. It was one of those things that not only was I just loved the world that Tolkien was describing, and loved the characters. I loved Bilbo, and I loved Elrond and Gandalf and everything in The Hobbit. But the other fun thing about it was the connection you could immediately make with other people once you found out that they liked it as well.
Wow, yeah.
So I was, around the time that my aunt bought me Return of the King, I spent 3 months at a different school, and I didn't know anyone. And so this is just when I was turning 12. And once I found out that somebody liked The Hobbit, like that, we were instant friends, right?
Yes.
And it still happens. I mean, look at the two of us now, right? I mean,
Yes.
it's amazing that this happens this way. But then what happened, sort of the next layer on top of that, was I really, really got interested in the world building side of things, because restricting myself to just the appendices, it wasn't just Appendix C on the language stuff. I was, of course, reading the background stuff about the First Age and Second Age and earlier parts of the Third Age and everything. And I'm like, I want to know more about this. And it's funny, I didn't end up getting Fellowship and Two Towers and reading the whole Lord of the Rings until decades later.
What?
because I got completely captivated by the First Age and Second Age stories. And so I tried reading the Silmarillion as a 12-year-old. Couldn't get further than the Aina Lindale, which I loved. But it was a struggle for a 12-year-old me anyway to read. But I was still fascinated by the world building.
Wow.
And I picked up a copy of Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth. This is, before Tolkien Gateway or anything like that existed, right? So the only source of information was books.
Wow.
And so I spent so much time with the Complete Guide to Middle-earth. And it's sort of just, little mini encyclopedia entries about all the characters and places and all that kind of stuff. So I knew that stuff, not from the point of view of a narrative, but just world build. I mean, it felt so real to me because I'm reading these encyclopedia entries telling me about these characters rather than this prose. And this was also around the time that Christopher Tolkien was publishing The History of Middle-earth.
Wow.
And so I remember the first volume of History of Middle-earth that I bought as a teenager was Shaping Middle-earth, which is volume 4 of the History of Middle-earth. And I hadn't read Lord of the Rings at this point, so I'm diving into all this Legendarium stuff. And then when the Peter Jackson films came out many years later, I thought I should actually read Lord of the Rings. Yeah. And did that. So yeah, I'm unusual in that I saw so at least for Fellowship, I saw the movie before I read the book. But I'd already read The History of Middle-earth and the Silmarillion by this stage. So it's a very, very, very strange reading order. I don't necessarily recommend other people do it. But looking back, you can sort of see how that shaped my particular engagement with Tolkien's material. Yeah.
For sure, it did. I don't think people would take that route, but there's something about reading Tolkien I've seen in hearing people's stories that like something inside of you connects with a part of the earth of the shaping, and so you want to like connect with that story in a unique way, and it's so vast that people connect with it in 1,000 different ways.
Yeah.
And you're passionate.
The other thing I'll just mention that sort of eventually came. It was probably the last phase, the most recent phase was connecting with the stories that themselves and the characters in particular. And one of the things that's meant a lot to me in the last few years is just those characters, particularly in Lord of the Rings, characters like Samwise and Faramir and to a lesser extent Círdan. You need to read a bit more to find out more about Círdan, but there's just these characters that are just such wonderful examples of I guess more the kind of people that we should be more of, right? And that's sort of, so quite apart from the world building and the sort of scholarly study, I've just fallen in love with these characters that I just think are such wonderful models for how to live our lives. Well. It's beautiful.
I'm curious because I'm sure you've read the story so many times and have gone into it with all your research. Like as you've grown older and just matured as a person, how has the stories shifted? Like, have they changed how you read them, how they impact you? Like, has there been a noticeable shift in how you approach them? Because as you get older, you're changing as a person.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does come down to those characters that have qualities that we don't necessarily appreciate in our youth. And as I said, I mean, that's Samwise, Faramir, Círdan, they're all these characters that, as a kid, they're not the ones that you get excited about and want to grow up to be, but they're now the kind of people that I want to be. Yes. So they're the characters that bring me to tears. They're the characters that, I just learn so much from. It's just that's been a really wonderful aspect of things as I've almost gone beyond the scholarship. The scholarship sort of overtook so much of my life for a long time. Yeah. It's only in the last few years that I've really started to appreciate, what, I want to be more like Faramir. I want to be more like Círdan. I want to be more like Samwise, and it sort of be a bit of an inspiration for how to live my life in a way.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, you're right. As a youth, those things they're not fantastical. It's not appealing to be humble and had that kind of courage.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I remember just reading through the books and being like, wow, this is the kind of character that I can see is going to impact a lot of people, but it's a quiet kind of impact.
Exactly.
And those kind of stories that Tolkien loves. I think he talks about, I just tweeted about the other day, reading through his letters, so much about the ennoblement of like the weak and the small. That's a beautiful thing. That's not sexy in the world, but it's beautiful.
Exactly.
I love it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so you are, I don't know if people can explain in one sentence what digital Tolkien is, but
Yep.
your website helps us, that you build tools that help scholars and fans better work with the text of Tolkien. I would love to know, why did you start this? Like, why not just do it yourself and just study yourself? Why make it a public thing? And just maybe unpack what is it? What kind of tools have you started to create?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, hopefully a little bit of history is helpful here. So, my work, my day job, if you like, has focused the last 30 years on building software to help people better understand texts in general. And the focus, it was initially biblical texts. So I was focused a lot on particularly New Testament Greek and ways of making the Greek New Testament more accessible to people. So I was interested in building tools for working with that text, and that expanded to a broader range of ancient Greek texts and medieval texts and Old English and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things sort of alongside that work, building software for doing philology with computers, was whenever I talked to other scholars, whether they be biblical scholars or Homeric scholars or Beowulf scholars or whatever it was, anyone that was dealing with texts that had been around for hundreds or thousands of years,
Wow.
that were also Tolkien fans, they would say things to me like, and they would always say it secretly as if admitting it was going to get them into trouble in their academic fields. They would say, you know what, Tolkien really reminds me of the Old Testament, Homer, Beowulf, whatever it was that they were studying academically. Yeah. They're like, you know, Tolkien more than anyone else has this richness that I associate with the texts that I'm studying in a scholarly context. And so I sort of came to this realization that Tolkien is not only a philologist, was not only a philologist himself, but a creator of works that are worthy of that kind of philological study, of the kind of study we do for these texts that are hundreds or thousands of years old. And so given that, if we assume that Tolkien's works are worthy of that kind of careful philological study, what does that mean in light of the fact that my career is building software for better understanding those kinds of texts? And so that led to this idea of what if we treated Tolkien's texts in this way, and what if I took the tools and the techniques that I work on in my day job and applied them to Tolkien's text, treat them seriously as objects of study, as if they were texts that were hundreds of years old. And so that led to the Digital Tolkien project, which I had an opportunity to first... Well, I launched it in 2018, but my sort of first big declaration of it was actually at the Tolkien 2019 conference in Birmingham. It was the 50th anniversary of the Tolkien Society, and there was a big conference there. And so Tom Shippey was there, and Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull were there, and a bunch of other wonderful Tolkien scholars. And I got up on stage and basically said what I said to you, that I thought Tolkien's works were worthy of this rich philological study. Yeah. And not only that, but that we should apply the very latest, greatest digital philological techniques to doing this. Of course, the big difference between the normal texts that I work with and Tolkien's texts is the fact that they're not in the public domain. They're still under copyright. Yeah. And so there are certain things that I can't do. And so a lot of the thought that happened in the early days and still continues is, how can I build tools that let people engage with the text and do interesting scholarly study of the text without actually sharing the text with people? Because I wanted to be extremely respectful of the publishers and the Tolkien estate and make sure I wasn't doing anything inappropriate there. And so a lot of the work, the very first thing I did, besides sort of building digital editions of the text, which I couldn't share but I could use myself, was to have to build citation systems around this. This is one of the things we do. Almost everyone's, I'm sure, familiar with the fact that in the Bible we have books, chapters, and verses, right? And that was not in the original text. That was something that scholars did in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, because they wanted a way of referring to the text. And so that's the first thing I set about to do. And building on work of others like Eric Muller-Harder, who'd done this for Lord of the Rings, basically coming up with a similar kind of logical referencing scheme. So instead of saying page 300, which doesn't make sense if you have a different edition, you can't.
Yep. There's a lot of them.
You can instead say, we're talking about book 2, chapter 5, paragraph 37. And so I started building those citation systems, started building a way of searching the text to find out what the citation system would be, being able to go the other way around from citation system to help find the paragraph. And then once you've got this sort of citation system, you can then start to attach other annotations to that. So as you do linguistic annotations or of what characters are appearing and what adjectives are used and what time of day is it and what all of those sorts of things, you can represent that in terms of the references into the text, and you can share those annotations without having to share the text. And as long as somebody's got the text, then they can bring it together at the other end. And so that was sort of the starting point. And then there is so much we're building on top of that now, just in terms of these annotations. This is a lifetime effort, I think, and there's still a lot more to do even with the citation system. So we've just started building citation systems around the Great Tales, so wow. Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, and the Fall of Gondolin books, and there's ongoing work to do a citation system for the history of Middle-earth, which is going to take a long time. But one of the nice things about that, it's not just the citation system, is in the case of history of Middle-earth and unfinished tales as well, there's a lot of structure we want to capture in the books, because they're not just texts like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or The Silmarillion. They've got text notes, they've got commentary and so on. And we need to, in our digital editions, clearly separate each of those components out, which is going to lead to a lot of really interesting things. So one of the things we can't quite do yet is if you're searching for when a particular word is used, which you can do through our search interface, sometimes you may care about whether it's in the commentary or in the actual text, if it's a word Christopher used versus a word that his father used.
That's good.
And so once we have that structure in place, you'll be able to do that kind of searching. But even within something like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, one of the things that we did last year, and this actually helped with my master's dissertation, a group of us, a bunch of volunteers, went through The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, and annotated who was speaking in every case where there was direct speech. And what that then enables us to do is we don't just search for words. We can now say, when does Aragorn use this word? When does Sam use this? Or do studies, and this is a large part of what my MA dissertation was on, how the different characters speak. How does the speech of Sam differ from Frodo's? How does the speech of the Hobbit differ from elves? And that sort of stuff. As well as how, another aspect of that which we can get into is how the narrative text of the different works differs. This was actually probably the main thing that I was looking at in my dissertation was, people say, the style of the Silmarillion is very different from the style of Lord of the Rings, which is different from the Hobbit. But what does that actually mean? When you say the style is different, how do we quantify that? Are there actually linguistic properties we can look at? And it turns out there are, and that's what I did. So, coming back to the sorts of things that we're doing at the Digital Tolkien project, preparing these electronic editions, having these citation systems, annotating this structure, annotating linguistic information. But there's so much more that we're building on top of that. And what I want to do more than anything else is really facilitate other scholars to do the kind of work that they want to do. So if a scholar is wondering, and this is a question that comes up, does Tolkien use more Germanic words than Latinate words in certain parts of the text? Like, you may have a hypothesis that Tolkien uses more Germanic words when during the Rohirrim chapters than he does elsewhere, right? So how would you actually test that? Well, in order to do that, you have to look at every single word that's used and determine whether it's of Germanic or Latinate origin. We haven't finished that yet, but that's one of the projects that we're working on, is to build a database of all the words that Tolkien uses, and then working with things like the Oxford English Dictionary, get the etymological information. There's some fun stuff that we just started to do with the poetry, especially now that the collected poems has come out. One of the things we've just launched the beginnings of a website that I'm hoping will let people study particularly the formal aspects of the poem, like finding where Tolkien rhymes in a particular way, what words he rhymes with other words, what metrical patterns he uses, how that changed over time. So did he use particular rhyming schemes or metrical patterns or structural properties of the poem in the early days and then not use them later? How does that all work? There's all that sort of stuff as well that we're looking into, and we've dabbled as well into adaptations. We've done a bunch of stuff with Rings of Power that we could get into as well. So there's just a lot of work ahead of us, but it's wonderful. Any excuse to spend large amounts of time with with the works of Tolkien.
And I imagine those endeavors take a large amount of time. I mean, it sounds like that's very detailed work.
Yeah, and this is a misconception that I'm hoping to fix. Is I think there's a sort of assumption that maybe because we're using computers or because it's digital that somehow we're trying, like somehow it's a shortcut or speed things up, and it's not at all. The careful consideration that gets associated with philology is still there in the stuff that we're doing digitally. I think the difference with doing it digitally is that it's easier to share, it's easier to collaborate. Yeah. There's less unnecessary repetition of effort. We can do something once and then reuse it later on. But in terms of the actual scholarship, this is something that I often say to people, that the scholarship is the same. Whether it's a print book or a website or a database or whatever it is, the underlying scholarship is still the same. It's just presenting it in a different way that enables people to interact with the results in different ways. Yeah.
I'm curious, with all this stuff you've done with research and diving into just the minute details of the text and then zooming out to see the meta themes, narratives, and like repetitions, how has it, let's bring it down to like impact, how has it enriched or changed the way you've read the story? Or maybe how has it changed the way other people have read, maybe you've heard back? Like getting that far into the details, I'm sure it's changed the way you've seen Tolkien's writings.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I think we still need to do a lot more work on to really get a sense of it. But a couple of things that I can touch on. One has to do just with Tolkien's amazing ability to alter the style that he writes in, depending on the context. And this comes back to what I was saying about sort of trying to quantify the differences between works and between speakers. So let me say, I'll give a couple of examples of that, and then I can talk about some other things as well. So at a really simple level, this sort of blew my mind. One of the things that I did in my dissertation was I looked at the frequency of function words. This is something that it's really sort of a surprising fact in corpus linguistics, is that if you're looking at words, what words get used commonly in a text. If you look at the nouns and the verbs and the sort of content words, they tell you about the content, the topic of the text. And you can very easily, in many cases, tell what the text is just from what the common nouns and verbs and stuff like that. Which is not necessarily that surprising. That if you get words like burglar and mutton, it's the Hobbit. If you get things like ban and yearning and stuff like that, it's the Silmarillion, and then Lord of the Rings will have I think ruffian is only in Lord of the Rings, and file, as in Galadriel's file, is that word file is only in Lord of the Rings. So you can get a sense of the topic, but that's not the style. It turns out that you get a sense of the style by looking at the function words, the, and, of, in, to, those sorts of words. And one of the striking things that I discovered, it's really, really simple, is if you look at the frequency of the word of in the Silmarillion versus the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, you can pretty much tell whether it's the Silmarillion or one of the other two, just from the proportion of the words in a chapter that are of.
What?
Which sounds, and it's striking. It's like, I think with 95% accuracy, if you said, I've got a chapter, I'm not going to tell you whether it's from the Silmarillion or Lord of the Rings, but I'm going to tell you what proportion of the words are of. With 95% accuracy, I could tell you whether it's the Silmarillion or Lord of the Rings. And the reason is, it's simple. The reason is that, for stylistic reasons, Tolkien is much more likely to say something in the Silmarillion like the sons of Feanor rather than Feanor's sons.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. It's just a really simple little stylistic change, but it totally characterizes the difference between the Silmarillion and the others. And within speech, another similar example that I discovered was, I was interested in contractions, whether people say don't or do not. And if you go through just within speech and you look at whether what proportion of do nots become don'ts in each of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, you discover something really interesting. First of all, the Silmarillion never uses the word don't. It always says do not. In the Hobbit, it's almost always don't. So the Hobbit very rarely uses do not. The Lord of the Rings is split 50-50 exactly between do not and don't, which in itself is really interesting, right? To just that one measure, you can easily distinguish the Hobbit from the Lord of the Rings from the Silmarillion. But it got me thinking, and this is what the original impetus was for doing that speaker identification work, where we went through all of the direct speech and worked out who the speakers were. I wondered if the reason in Lord of the Rings that you get that 50-50 split is that it depends on who's saying it.
Yeah.
And what was remarkable, and again, this just speaks to Tolkien's ability to take on different styles depending on the speaker and the context and everything. It falls beautifully along character lines. And so elves will always say do not. No elf ever says don't. Bilbo and most of the and Samwise and I think the Gaffer and so on, they will always say don't. Orcs will always say don't. Gondorians will always say do not. So there's this really clear sort of almost class-based dividing line. But the really, really interesting thing is that there are some characters that mix them. Frodo, Merry, and Pippin will mix them. Samwise will always say don't, but Frodo will sometimes say do not. Gandalf will mix it. Aragorn will mix it. And so you get these characters, are particularly interesting, I think, with Gandalf and Aragorn. These are characters that will talk differently depending on their audience. They talk in a more hobbity way to hobbits and a more formal way to Gondorians or elves and so on. And the final thing I noticed was that Saruman is one of the characters that sometimes says do not, sometimes says don't. But what's really interesting is he only starts saying don't after his humiliation. When he's the beggar on the road is when he starts to say don't. So it's just it seems such a simple thing. We're literally just counting whether Tolkien says do not or don't. But combined with all that other annotation work of who's speaking and all that kind of stuff, you get these really interesting results that just demonstrate in a quantitative way just how brilliant Tolkien was at writing different characters that speak differently. So
that's amazing, because I know as you learn about Tolkien's story, this wasn't accidental. He's a philologist.
Exactly.
He loves it, and he talks about the aesthetic of language.
Exactly.
Like, this matters to him.
Absolutely, and we see it in other places too. So one observation that had been made by numerous scholars, and even C.S. Lewis comments on this in The Hobbit. C.S. Lewis talks about this sort of shift in The Hobbit from fairy tale to epic towards the end, and that the style changes. And with these kinds of measures that I'm talking about, of how often certain function words are used and so on, you can actually detect that in the text as well. There's definitely a distinction that happens in the last 5 or 6 chapters of The Hobbit as well. Very, very deliberate though. Tolkien would have been very aware of what he was doing with this stuff, and it's just wonderful to discover it, because it's something that as a reader you're not necessarily conscious of, but you subconsciously notice it. I'm sure, right? It just leads to that realism and just appreciation of differences between characters and sort of different registers in which you want to convey the sort of mythological parts versus the much more down to earth hobbity kind of aspects of it all as well. Yeah, it's just a wonderful confirmation of what we already know about Tolkien, but it's nice seeing it in that sort of quantitative linguistic way. Yeah.
I mean, for someone who's coming to the stories for some of the first times, maybe through Rings of Power, through the movies, they're reading it, and then they hear this interview, and they hear about the level of detail you're going. Someone might feel that could strip away the wonder of the story. I imagine it hasn't for you. It probably has widened the kind of wonder. How?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there's a sense in which sometimes when Gandalf himself says about the problems of breaking something to see how it works. And I hope that's not what I'm doing here. But
forgive us, Gandalf.
I mean, there is a sense in which sometimes when you work out how something is working, there's a risk that it loses some of its magic. And to be honest, I mean, Tolkien himself talked about this, and Christopher, this was a concern with the Silmarillion, right? That publishing the Legendarium, because when they were just these sort of textual ruins in Lord of the Rings, they added this incredible depth. There was this thing off in the horizon that you knew that there was these first age myths and so on in Lord of the Rings. And both J.R.R. and Christopher talk about what happens when you actually go visit those mountains off in the distance, which is sort of what you do with to a certain extent with the Silmarillion. So I think there's always that tension there, I guess. But certainly for me, it's just added to my wonder and love of everything that Tolkien's done. It hasn't taken it away from me. Yeah,
I love it. I love it because I'm still new to the world. So me going on and seeing the things you're pulling out, I think you're really right. It doesn't detract from the story. It doesn't distract someone from all these details or patterns. Actually has an impact on you without almost an indirect impact, like you said. You don't notice it, but it's like something shifting with the way he's doing this. And he was so methodical about that. That's why it took him so long. So I love that you're bringing that out.
Yeah, and it also can lead to interesting questions and maybe people wanting to dive in more to certain aspects of it. So one of the things that I only just I looked up last night and tweeted about was the fact that Gondolin is mentioned more in The Hobbit than it is in Lord of the Rings.
Wow.
And you may say, well, what does that matter? Well, if that inspires in people interesting questions to find out more about Gondolin and why would Gondolin be mentioned more in The Hobbit than Lord of the Rings, that's one of the things that I want to sort of support and encourage is these facts aren't necessarily, those kinds of numerical facts aren't necessarily groundbreaking in their own right, but they can lead to really interesting questions that
That's right.
that get people more and more engaged with the text.
Love that.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, because all these books are still coming out, just a few more questions on this. So many, I don't have a budget for all the books that keep coming out on Tolkien. I'm like, stop. How is there more books keep coming out every month? And I love it. So there's so much that's still yet to be published. What are some, like, as you look 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, is there a future for Digital Tolkien that you're like, man, I would love to create these kind of tools, but we're not there yet, or do something on this kind of special, unique part of the writing? Anything that you would love to see coming down the pipe one day?
Yeah. So, I mean, my grand vision has, right from the beginning, been to build a online reading environment that lets people engage with the texts in ways that aren't currently possible.
Yeah.
And you really, I mean, something like, sitting down and reading Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit's a different matter. That I don't imagine I'll add much to that. But when you read through the history of Middle Earth, there are multiple times, and I'm going to talk about this in my talk at the Christopher Tolkien Centenary Conference in
So
6 or 7 weeks or so. There are numerous times where Christopher says, I had to make a choice here because there's a bunch of different ways I could have presented this, and there's all sorts of limitations in the print book as to how I can do this. And every time I see him do that, I'm like, Christopher, I wish I could. If you can hear me, Christopher, I'm working on it. I'm trying to enable this kind of, because this is exactly what digital reading environments enable. Is this sort of, because one of the things, again, just a misconception that I want to clarify, fix, is the print books are not the scholarship itself. Print books are one way of presenting the results of the scholarship. There are other ways, and in some cases, the printed book is not the best mechanism. And this is something that has been realized for decades in classics and biblical studies and stuff like that. Right? There's all sorts of tools we now have for engaging with those texts, and I want to see those tools for Tolkien's text as well. Particularly things like the history of Middle Earth, because there's so much that there's so many limitations in a print book that you can completely blow apart if you've got a digital edition, and enable, Christopher was playing around with that to a certain extent. The Great Tales books give a different perspective on many of the same fragmentary texts that he quotes in History of Middle Earth. So History of Middle Earth is very much chronological, longitudinal, whereas you get, something like, well, not so much Children of Húrin, but particularly Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin books that he published towards the end of his life, taking a different angle, looking at the texts along a different dimension. Those sorts of things are so much easier to enable in a digital reading environment. So that's where I'd eventually like to get. That requires a tremendous amount of work in terms of the annotation of the texts, but it also requires, obviously, engagement with the publisher and the estate and so on. And particularly publishing is a very conservative industry, slow to change. So there's a lot of work to do there, I think, in convincing them of the benefits of it all as well. But that's certainly where I would like to see things in 10 or 20 years' time. I'm so hoping exciting that we just have a whole bunch of new tools for enabling people to work with and study, explore, not just the final published text like Lord of the Rings, but all of the amazing stuff that Christopher has given us in the history of Middle Earth and elsewhere. Yeah.
It's quite stunning that people ask, you have a Twitter account on Tolkien? What do you tweet about? Like, they have no clue, right? I'm like, right. I'm overwhelmed by the possibilities of what I could tweet about. I mean, and I haven't even read everything. So it shows the brilliance and the depth and the texture by which Tolkien wrote, that we can take apart stories like these and see so many different unique angles. Yeah, I think it's beautiful. Okay, a few just quick hot takes.
Absolutely.
Because everyone needs some hot takes from James. So What's your hot take on Rings of Power, James? Give it to us.
Okay, so I think season 2 has been. I've had a couple of problems with it, but for the most part, it's been phenomenal. I've enjoyed it more than season 1. One of the things I said after season 1 was that. So I co-host the Rings of Power wrap-up podcast, and we did at the end of season 1 we did this kind of review and we gave it a grade and everything. And at the time I gave season 1, I said I'm giving it a C, but it could be a B depending on how certain parts of the storyline get resolved, how they continue. Yeah. This is, I think, an important thing to recognize with Rings of Power is you can't necessarily judge the scenes just in the context in which they're initially presented. We've got to wait and see in many cases because we do get things resolved in ways that all of a sudden make sense. They didn't at the time. They were just a setup. But once you see the payoff at the end, you're kind of like, you know what? Now I know why they did it that way. So I think I've changed my season 1 grade from a C to a B in light of things. And honestly, I would give. I'm preempting what I'm going to say here on Rings of Power wrap up, but I would probably give season 2 an A. I didn't love the Hrun parts, but everything else to me was just, it's amazing. Once you sort of realize what they're doing and not worry too much about, but they're doing that in the wrong order, and that's supposed to happen 5 years before that. And once you get away from that kind of nitpicking and you just appreciate it, particularly for the way that some of the themes are conveyed, it's just done a phenomenal job. I mean, just to pick one thing, the way that the show has shown the complex relationships between parents and children has just been incredible. Whether it's Elrond talking about how he just wishes he could talk to his father, which had me in tears, to the Durin, King and Prince Durin talking to one another, which also has me in tears, to Theo and Isildur, and there's just so many
everywhere.
It's everywhere, and it's just wonderful to see. And also just another. Just that whole, I intensely disliked in season 1 Finrod's whole "you've got to touch the darkness," right? But I'm so glad that now the season 2 message has been it's not, you don't fight the darkness with strength, but you fight it with the light. Yeah. And I hear those sorts of things and I'm like, yes, they've got it right. So I'm really happy with the way it's gone, and I'm excited to see what they do for the rest of the show.
With you. I'm sorry that you probably lost 400 followers after this airs because of your opinion on it.
I don't care. I don't care.
I love it. It's so fun to be back in Middle Earth. I just think it's a joy that we get to see it. And I think if we're so cynical, we miss the wonder that there is there. So one last question real quick. You talked about themes. And I think that's the strongest point of Rings of Power. There are the themes that are interwoven through, and that's what we love about the story. I'm just curious, bring it back to our day and age right now in this kind of tense moment, especially in the U.S. and around the world. There's tensions and divisions. What theme from Tolkien do you think the world needs the most right now? Like, what lesson do we need to learn that you would love to see around?
It's hard for me to pick just one, actually. But we touched on it right at the start when I was talking about the sort of characters that now as an adult I admire, and I think you were the one that used the word gentle, and I think there's other sort of words around that. One of the things that I've realized again as an adult is just the importance of kindness, and actually I really love the word kindness over the word love, just because love can mean all sorts of people can interpret love to mean all sorts of different things. When you say kindness, it's much clearer what the actual practical day-to-day action is. And I have to the sort of related word to that as well that comes up a lot is pity as well, and just that and of course I have to shout out to Tom Hillman's amazing book on that topic. So that I know that's sort of more of a cluster of themes, sure. But that sort of that gentleness in spirit, that kindness, that's We just need more. We need more of that because it's light that will not strength.
Yeah. Appreciate it, James.
Yeah.
That's it, man. Yeah, we need that. If we can have a little bit more, that would be wonderful. James, we've been talking for 50 minutes. We could talk for another 50 minutes easily.
Okay.
We can nerd out on a lot. Maybe we'll have you back for sure to go into some
I love
specifics. Where can people follow you and engage with your work?
Absolutely. So digitaltolkien.com is the main website, and from there we link to a bunch of other projects that we work on. Probably the best way to sort of keep updated on all the things that we're doing is actually my YouTube channel, the Digital Tolkien YouTube channel. I do a monthly live stream where I give an update on all the various things we're doing. So that's probably the best place to find out all of the ongoing work, because I haven't even touched on a ton of stuff that we're doing. So check that out to find out more.
Yeah. Folks, you need to follow James. If you're not, Digital Tolkien on Twitter. You're on Threads as well.
I don't use Threads. Instagram I post a decent amount on. So yeah. If you like pretty charts, follow Instagram.
Yes. I like how I've seen those charts. I don't know if everyone would call those pretty. I like them. They're pretty to me. So, it's been a joy, James, to have you on here. It's a joy to follow you and see what your work you're doing. It's really cool to see people like you just with a passion for Tolkien spreading it, because you encourage me to go deeper into the works. And so, yeah, thanks for chatting, friend. We'll talk soon. Thank you all for joining us on another interview from The Wonder of Tolkien. These interviews are so fun because there's so many people doing amazing work out there with the stories of Middle-earth. And my goal for everything I post online and the content is just to produce more wonder, to kind of re-enchant us in a world where we're easily disenchanted. So I hope you go out there and do what James says, be kind and show some pity. Thanks, y'all. Thanks, James.